Since the Russian-Ukrainian war broke out, it's as if the African countries cannot actually make their own decision. A number of African countries have come under enormous pressure as a result of their decision to select their own partners. If you look at the interaction between Europe and also United States, specifically with African countries, I will point it out to be their own partners. African nations are as if they can just make a decision on their own, and they are not able to select who their partner will be. The narrative in Western media has been, and also in geopolitical circles, has been that once an African country engages with China or Russia, it's as if they are going away from their normal standard. It's as if African countries lack that understanding on how to pursue their own foreign policy and what best suit their own country and their own people. By just focusing on Russia and China, I believe the Western countries are missing out on what is expected of them as geopolitical partners and how to interact with African nations. Let's listen to what these experts have to say, and we will join you on the other side.
So it's really important that Washington be paying attention to what's going on the continent as directed by the Russians right now. I think my biggest takeaway from the hearing was how aggressive tactics to roll back Russia would actually have potentially adverse consequences for our relationships in Africa. Our African partners have been telling us that they don't want to be made to choose between the United States and Russia. They don't want to be the subjects of a kind of Cold War competition between these two great powers. And so I think the word of caution that I offered to the Congress is as much as we might be trying to combat or roll back Russian malign influence, we have to be sensitive to the local context that we do it in, sensitive to the needs and the agency of our African partners, and not treat them as pawns in a great power competition.
What baffles me with regards to the perception on China and also Russia's interaction with Africa, it's just amazing on how the geopolitical partners of Africa perceive this relationship to be like something new. I think it's not new. Before even the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia was in Africa already. But what is new is the way that they perceive it to be, as if the African countries cannot at all actually select their own different partners in terms of strategic options, security, and also in geopolitical sphere, businesses, and also development, social issue, and also infrastructural development. The way that the Russian interaction with Africa has been perceived in the Western media is that of negativity, and that the African nations are actually approaching a dangerous neighbor, or actually looking at working alongside a country which is against the Western looking at their geopolitical interest. But what I also understand is that African countries are free to make their own decision, and we all have seen how they are making that decision. What the United States of America and also other geopolitical partners of Africa should consider, that African countries have emerged and they are actually making that decision openly, as we've all have seen in the United Nations and other areas. So it's wrong for the United States to perceive African nations as being unable to choose their own partners.
On the subject of Russia's activities and influence in Africa, particularly through military engagement, we see Russia developing a lot of relationship with various countries. But these relationships are not new. Russia, in the days of the Soviet Union, stood alongside a lot of African countries as these were fighting for independence from colonial powers. Now the Russians are back trying to call on their friends across the continent. This, of course, puts an onus on the United States, especially when we consider the Ukraine war. We saw during the UN resolution vote, not all African countries voted the same way. Why did the countries in Africa not align themselves with the West or with the United States? This is because the US is not engaging Africans directly. It's because they're going through the former colonial powers. That is a disadvantage.
When an African country decides to make their own decision, they are either being threatened by their foreign partners, or are also being threatened that they will be sanctioned in several ways. I think this aspect of using sanction to use it as a tool to basically work with African partners, it's not going to work so far, as we all have seen. Especially the country of South Africa has come under enormous pressure from specifically one of its most important partner, the United States of America. I think that the South African people have decided not to cave from the pressure from the West. I also believe other African countries are watching, and there's no doubt on why African nations are voting differently in the United Nations Security Council and in a number of areas. The General Assembly sort of point out this has gone a long way to shape the perception that most African nations have alongside their Western partners. The deal here is that when you use sanction and also your own interest to mean that the way the global nations should make decisions, but I think that's not going to work, as we all have seen. The United States will continue to lose in interest, and Europe will continue to lose partners in Africa towards China and Russia, if this attitude of using sanction and threat should be a tool of diplomacy in the 21st century.
We speak with our African friends, trying to explain to them that neutrality is not the answer.
Far from the front lines of the Ukraine-Russia war, both countries have been fighting a proxy battle to charm the African continent and earn support for their relative sides. Eritrea and Mali have sided with Russia, whereas about half of African states have consistently voted on Ukraine's side. But in a February 2023 UN resolution calling for Russia to withdraw, of the 32 states to abstain, almost half of them were African. A further 6 didn't show up to the vote at all. The war has put many African countries in an awkward position, caught between Western-backed Ukraine and Russia, with whom many countries have historic ties.
La volonté des uns et des autres menace de transformer l'Afrique en terrain de bataille géostratégique, recréant de ce fait une nouvelle version de la guerre froide.
Many African nations have indeed refused to openly take sides.
Nous avons pris une position abstentionniste, une position de neutralité, une position de non-alignement pour éviter que ce conflit puisse atteindre d'autres régions, notamment le continent africain.
Some African partners do not still understand the importance of the continent of Africa. They have perceived the African country as a continent where there is just too many problems to be solved, issues here and there. But I think that China and Russia perceive Africa from a different perspective. China perceives Africa as a business destination where businesses can also operate, and there is going to be a win-win situation. The United States, on the other hand, also sees Africa from a different perspective, and also an area where they have to engage and tackle China's presence and Russia. European Union members are also operating at some aspect with business hand, on the other hand using sanctions in several ways to operate in the continent. However, the continent of Africa has 40% of the world's gold and up to 90% of its chromium and platinum. The largest reserve of cobalt, diamond and platinum and uranium in the world are in Africa. It holds about 65% of the world's arable land and then percent of the planet's internal renewable freshwater resources. If you look at the continent in general, as we consider population, according to forecast, Africa's total population will reach nearly 2.5 billion by 2050. In 2023, the continent of Africa had around 1.36 billion inhabitants, with Nigeria, Ethiopia, and also Egypt as the most populous countries. Countries like China perceive Africa to mean business, where in the American policy circle, it's perceived as a continent that has too many problems to be solved.
So in the end, people wonder, they say, in Africa we actually need economic development. Where is the US in this? So China then takes the lead in terms of, everybody knows the China Exim Bank. Very few people have heard about the US Exim Bank, and so on. How do we then tackle that? How does the US, with this plurality of interests, engage in the way that will have that presence?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think this is the challenge, right? And I think it goes beyond our government. It goes to our media as well, right? I mean, Africa is a problem in need of a solution. And the United States is typically leading on the solutions, whether it's deploying peacekeepers or responding to pandemics. Washington is always, I think, the lead, along with certain European partners, in trying to respond to the very real challenges that Africa has. But I think the way that translates into sort of the popular perception here is that Africa's a problem, is that it's at war, there's pandemic, there's these massive challenges in need of fixing. Whereas I think with China, with other countries, it's a land of opportunity. Right, it's seen, and we see when you travel to Africa, when I travel to Africa, you hear about not just the major Chinese, infrastructure projects. It's all the traders, it's all the small business guys that show up and are doing export import at a very local level. But there's tens of thousands of these local Chinese traders who are going to Africa because it's an opportunity, and because that's the popular perception in China. And I think that one thing that this summit can do is focus on the opportunities, right? Like, we're still going to be there providing humanitarian assistance, providing, peacekeepers, trying to sort out, conflicts and bring democracy. We're still going to be committed to doing all of those things. But at the same time, we have to rebalance the kind of overall narrative and make clear that it's not just a set of problems that need to be addressed with U.S. taxpayer money, that there are all of these opportunities for a growing middle class and for sectors that are underdeveloped, where U.S. businesses and U.S. know-how and expertise can really have an impactful role. And I think that's the hope of this summit this week, is that we can begin to rebalance this narrative. But again, the Biden administration, they can set the tone. But again, media has a lot to do with this, and I think that in our popular media here, there is this overwhelming impression that the news that we see about Africa is generally not good news.
Now, with such perception and also reviews, it gives a wrong impression about the continent of Africa and how the African government and its people should navigate. With such perception, African countries start thinking that they are being misunderstood in the global stage, that it is the right time for them to start picking up their new partners and for their leaders to speak out, because the pressure is enormous. It affects them economically, it affects them on social issues and also infrastructural development areas. If a country decided to select its own partners and deal with countries that it considers more important in its own position and interest, then sanction is being used, and also other tools in the diplomatic circles are being used to pressure nations in the continent of Africa. Then we begin to get what we are getting from the continent, because African countries have decided that they are not going to sit down and let other powers impose on them, that those days are over, and that they're never going to accept such interference and also imposition on their future.
And this, I will say it once again today, South Africa has not been and will not be drawn into a contest between global powers. We will maintain our position on the peaceful resolution of conflict wherever those conflicts occur. We are now also witnessing Africa being dragged into conflicts far beyond our own borders. Some countries, including our own, are being threatened with penalties for pursuing an independent foreign policy and for adopting a position of non-alignment. As African countries, we have painful memories of a time when proxy wars were waged on the soils of Africa by foreign superpowers. We have not forgotten the terrible, brutal legacy of first having our own continent carved up and colonized by European countries, only to find ourselves once more being pawns on a chessboard during the Cold War. We are not going back to that history. We refuse to go back to that period in history as Africans.
We want to thank you for watching. Let us know in the comment section on what you think with regards to how Africa is perceived with regards to making its own strategic decision on the global stage. Keep the conversation going. We encourage you to watch some other informative and educating content on African geopolitics on our YouTube channel. For now, we're looking forward to meeting you soon in our next episode. Have a good day. Bye-bye.